All right, I'm recording, and we have a test on Monday covering labs 1 through 7. Any questions on about the test or about any of that material? Yes.
Does the test involve
It's all code. I don't ask any fill in the blanks, vocabulary, essays, none of that. It's all right code. The 6 problems from on the spring test, 75 minutes plus. You can always squeeze 5 out of me at the end, but there's a class after this, so you can't squeeze too much more than that. But I gave 6 problems in the spring. I'll try to make it. And I gave them code so that it wasn't coding from scratch each time. And I've given you 4 of those problems as homework, 2 as one homework, 2 as another homework. So you've seen most of that test. And if you asked, I show you the rest. So you've seen 2/3 of the previous test. I would just ask and I'll show you the rest. So that's an idea. So if you look at that homework, which was 2 problems, and then the next homework was the 2 problems, 2 coding problems, that was one of my tests. So, well, 2/3 of one of my tests. So that will give you an idea of what my test will be like. Lots of partial credit, so don't get all hung up on debugging one thing that doesn't work and miss an entire problem. Sort of come in, get the easy points. I'll even sometimes have points of, write your name as a comment, import, you need to import a library to use JSON, or you import a library to use the operating system. Every little thing you have to do is worth something. And we've done those things before. I have examples. If you've done your homework, or done your labs and homework, you have examples. So you can get an awful lot of points just for doing the basic setup, and then spread your time among all the problems before you get really going, if you really need to debug on one thing. So time is a consideration. There's enough time to do it. Many people finished the exam, did quite well on it. But there is the danger of getting hung up in trying to debug one thing. So you just have to be disciplined and hop around and accumulate all the points, and then go back and debug. And who just showed up? Lanceel. Anything else? So it's pure coding. It'll come in little parts. I will give you, I don't know if maybe the first thing might be from complete scratch, but everything else I usually give you something and have you add to it. Especially like that tkinter interface. Those things take a while to make. So I'll probably give you one and have you mess around with it a bit, but not generate completely from scratch. Anything else? So expect to see most of the material from those labs 1 through 7. So expect to see CSV files, expect to see some JSON. JSON tends to throw people off. They think it's always the same, but you have to look at the JSON and see, is it an array? Is it an object? Does the object have a property that's an array? People just start trying to loop over the object when you have to loop over the array. So you need to sort of look into it a bit. If you made that mistake once or twice, you usually catch on. But it's, again, the danger is the people who are going to wait to the night before to do all the labs, and then are going to get hung up and stuck. This is our last meeting before that, but I will be around and available by Zoom and so on. Anything else regarding tests or things you want me to go over, old labs, things you're stuck on? Then let's look at new stuff. The new stuff is Flask, and we are doing forms. We're interacting with users. And today's topic, one of the main topics is validation, that we want to make sure that the user is filling out the form at least somewhat quasi correctly. Okay. So the first validation is going to be an input required validation. And that just means that they can't leave it blank. So let's have a look at that. And I'm just gonna, just gonna keep adding to this example. So documents 340 Flask VENV paste. Oh, I don't have anything to paste. I thought I had things to paste. Downloads. Copy. Documents 341 Flask VENV paste. Okay, and open up code. All right, so the app, what are they doing up there? App. Scripts. And oh, it's over here. Sorry. What we did now is, say they worked for 8 hours at $8 an hour. But if we leave the name blank, it's going to yell at us. That's the addition here. Okay, and the main addition is over here in the forms. First thing is, so we had a string field, that's where they enter their name. We had a submit field, that's the button for submitting. We had the select field, that was the drop down to choose the, I think we had a color and a computer language or something. We had the integer field for the number of hours, and we had the decimal field for the wage. And now here's the validators, and the first validator is the input required. And I put that here on the name, as well as on the hours and the wage. So I showed you what happened if I did not enter a name, but if I enter a name, Charles is Charlie, okay. But if I leave the hours blank, it's going to complain. And if I leave the wage blank, it's going to complain. But if I have the name and the hours and the wage, then I will move on. Okay, so that is, okay, so what did we need to do? So here we are on the, I have too many things open. way too many things open. Okay. So let's look at the forms. The forms, again, we had to import this thing that we're now using from WT Forms validators input required. And then before this just said name equals string field, parenthesis, quote, name, end quote, and parenthesis. Now we've added another argument of validators. And there are many possible validators. We're going to add a second validator ultimately to this. But so here's a validator that says that the input is required. And the submit field, we didn't do anything to. The language, we didn't do anything to. The color, we didn't do anything to. And we added the same validators. So the validators are a list because you can have more than one validator. And so you have the key, so you have a second argument. You use the keyword validators. It's going to be equal to a list. And at this stage, that list has one thing in it, and it is the input required validator. And you saw that it didn't allow me off the page until it was, everything was filled in. Okay. So that was in forms. App 4 didn't change. Something later, don't let me forget, something is going to change later on, where instead of saying is submitted, we're going to say is validated. So that this is going to, but not, it hasn't changed yet. So that change is coming. Don't let me miss it. But right now there's no change in app 4. There was a change in forms. Let's look at simple form. I didn't make any change in simple form. I didn't make any form in the layout. I didn't make any change in the form handler. But some of that is coming. So there will be other changes, but for now, that was the only change. The really only change so far was in forms, adding the import for the input required, and then adding that validator to certain fields. The drop-down lists, we didn't have to worry about. There's always, the first item is the chosen one if the user doesn't do anything else. So there is something in the drop-down lists, but there was nothing in hours or wage. If there was nothing in hours or wage or the name, it kept us on that page. And I didn't do anything. I don't think I did any style stuff yet. Simple style. This is the same old style. So I didn't do anything. This is the, when I tried to submit it and got this thing, that's sort of done for me. I didn't do that. It was, that's something it does. And here's the code behind the HTML, and there's a new field required. Okay. All right, so that's the first one. So adding validators, the first validator was they had to give us something. Now I'm going to add a length validator. So I'm going to say the first thing is a first name. The first thing is a name, and I'm not going to accept a single letter. So you're not allowed to put in X. But if you have a very short name, it will take it. So I'm going to allow 2 letters in case you just have a 2-letter name, but it won't accept that. So that is the next addition. That. copy these documents, 341, Flask, V and V, paste. And now let's Control C to stop it. Run it again. Flask run. And it's here in Edge. I'm going to put in D. So I'm going to try to pretend my name is just D. And I have hours, I have wages, I have a color, I have a programming language, but I'm trying to get away with the name of just D. And it says name length must be between 2 and 6 characters. And but if I say die, then it accepts it. So that is the new addition, a validator that validates on the length. And I also have a length on the other side, but I think I have it up in the 90s, and I'm not going to type 90-some characters. So, all right, so let's have now a look, and we'll start with forms. And we start with, in our list of imported validators, we're now importing the length validator. The name field, so here's the label name. Here's what I'm calling it in code, name. It's a string, so it's like a text input. I have a validator, which I told you was a list, and then there is the input required, and I put a message here, but usually the input required gets sort of handled automatically. So you don't see the message, it just gets handled automatically. But here's the new length requirement. It has to, oh, I didn't do 90, I only did 60. But so it's between a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 6 characters I'm expecting. And then there's a message. And this is the message that you saw, and that's the message. So you see that I wrote the message. So again, what do we need for this length? We need to import the length type of validator. We are the validators. We have a validators argument. The validators argument is a list. I had a first item in my list was the input required. I have a second one, which is a length, which has a min, a max, and a message. And that's the submit didn't change, the language didn't change, the color didn't change, the integer and the wage didn't change from what they just were 5 minutes ago. Okay. Is there any difference in app 4? App 4 is now not is submitted, but asks, is it valid? If the field is required, if you added that little required thing, it just didn't send it at all. So it didn't go up to the server, it stayed on the client and gave its own little indicator of what was wrong. That was sort of made up by the browser. But now that I am having a sort of a more challenging validation, a length validation, I switch my if to valid. Before this said this, before this if was if it was submitted. See here, I have it commented out. That was my old if. Are you submitted? Because you wanted that this route was handling the page that they filled out and then the answer to the page they filled out. So we had to know whether it was submitted or not. But now that we're doing validation, the question isn't whether it was submitted, but whether it was valid. And I'm printing out if it was valid. So you'll see down here trues and falses. Okay. So it's not, so we made a change in app 4. Where we switched over to validate. If we keep submitted instead of validate, it's not going to go back. You're going to hit the button, they're going to send you up here, it may not be right, but it was submitted. So if the only question you ask is if it was submitted, you will carry on. That's useful to know. Sometimes I have an error, I don't know what the hell it is, and so I'll switch back to is submitted because you know, I want to get on with my life. But if I know, if I can figure it out, then I really want to ask the question, is it valid? Okay. Things get hairy when we're connecting to a database and we have, we're going back and forth to the database, back and forth with the user, back and forth to the database. Things can get hairy. Sometimes I'll just give up and I'll go back to 31, but we much prefer to be to have 33 when we can. Okay, so that's what changed here, the if. Again, none of the validation stuff beyond is required is going to show up for us if we're not asking the right question. So this came up when I didn't fill out the form right, it came up as a false, and therefore it didn't go over to the handler, but it came back to the form. Okay. Then we saw something on the form, and it was what I wrote, not just some default browser thing. So that's on here on the simple form. And here's where I put that. Here's my form. Here's where I'm writing the label for the form. So that's where it says the word name. Let me go back. So that word name, that's here. Form, name, label. That's up here, the word name. Then form, name, size equals 30. That is this box. And then here I have a span that is of the class error, and class is for styling. So this beautiful style you see here is going to be over in my style sheet. So we're going to have to look for that. And here I've said, take all the errors that are associated with the name, and there could be multiple errors. I could, you know, come up with other possible errors. Right now, there's the required and the length requirement. But I'm sending, so I'm asking the form, I'm asking particularly about the name input, any errors associated with it, I'm going to join with a vertical bar. So if I had 2 errors or 3 errors, I would see all the errors and they would be a vertical bar. There was only 1 error at a time. It was either I didn't input anything and it never left the page to begin with, or I didn't have a long enough name and then it came back and it showed me that 1 error about the length. But if you remember, what showed up is what shows up if I try to submit something with the one thing that's not too long, that error message shows up. Okay, and nothing else changed. No, one other thing changed. Here's an important thing that changed. You should put in this CSRF token. So this is cross scripting. So what can happen is that if you have a form and a handler, then somebody can try to reach your handler, but not come through your form. So these two are supposed to work as a pair, and then somebody can try to intercept you and send stuff to your handler without coming through your form and without going through any validation that you might have had. And so that's what this guy is about. So if we have a form and a form handler and we're worried about validation, then we have to have this token thing here And that's sort of some communication between the form and the handler to make sure, you know, they're working as a team and nobody's trying to get one past us. Okay, so that's another thing that you won't see if you don't ask the question over here in app 4, if you don't switch the question from is submitted to validate, you're not going to see any error messages. And if you don't in the simple form have this token, it's going to always be wrong. This is how they know, this is how they behind the scenes pair up the form and the handler. And if they're not paired up, it will be assumed to be invalid. So you will not see this. If you don't have this, it's just going to be false, false, false. You're going to be looking for the mistake for a long time and not find it, and then be kicking yourself when it was this. I know I've done it. Okay. So in the form, so we saw what was in the form, we added the new validator for length, the length requirement. In the app 4, we switched it from is submitted to valid on submit. In the form, that's the form handler. In the form, we added an error message and the CSRF token. The handler, I don't think we made any changes. I don't think I made any changes to the handler. I have, if you recall in my Ginger here, I had this thing that said, if they didn't enter anything, I could probably take this Ginger out, because now that I have some validation, some length validation, they can't leave it blank. So this was like my old way of on the handler saying, hey, you didn't enter anything, but I don't really need this anymore because this if is never going to happen. They can't get here. With my new validation, they can't get here unless they put something more than one character into the length box. Okay. And one last thing to look at is in the static under the simple, I added a new class style, so that I gave on the form, I had a span, it was of the error class, and now here is my styling of error. I made the background dark salmon and the color dark red. So that's the writing, that's the background, that's the writing. And you saw that when I made a mistake, it was this dark red on salmon. Okay. Questions? Now what? One more type of validation, and then one other trick, and then I'll be done for the day, and it'll be your turn. So the next validation is going to be a number range. So we are going to ask, not that the number have a certain length, not that it be 2 digits or something, that would be like what we had before, the length. But we're going to say that the number has to be in a particular range. So, you know, less than, you know, more than this and less than that, sort of a thing. Okay. So we're going to add one more type of validation. So you're expecting to see one more thing in the imports, some more validation down. This is going to be on the wage and the hours. Copy. Place. Okay. So the first place we're going to look is in the forms. Here's a new type of validation, the number range. So we imported a new type of validator, WT forms validators. So now we have it's required, the length, we had a length on the name, and we're going to have a number range requirement on the wage and the hours. Name is still required and has a length restriction. Submitted is just a button. There's nothing to it. I didn't do anything yet with language or color. So the hours now has an input required and a number range. So I said the minimum number of hours could be 0. The maximum number of hours is 85. And the message will be not a valid number of hours. The wage is, the input is required, and then there's a number range. The minimum wage I'm going to say is $7.50. The maximum wage I'm going to say is $200 an hour. That's a nice salary. That's a nice wage. And then I'll say not a valid wage. So here on the forms, it was number required, another input. And then down here on these numbers, we added a number range validator. So again, validators was an argument of integer field. It was a list. And now the new thing is the second thing in the list, the number range. And the number range, we are giving 3 things, a min, a max, and a message. Okay. Were there any changes to App 4? I don't think so. We've switched over to valid on submit. So we're good. That was the only change on the App 4. Let's look at the form. That's the handler. Let's look at the form. I have the CSRF. I have the name with its errors. And now that there are errors on the wage and hours, I'm going to do something like this down there for them. Nothing on the language, nothing on the color. Here's the hours. I added a span to show my error messages for the wrong number of hours. Here's an error message for the wrong numbers for wages. And I don't think I did anything to the handler. And I don't think I did anything to the style this time. So let's Control C to stop it and then start it again. Okay, so I have some name, Sally. Sally is like Python and blue, and Sally claims to have worked 100 hours and makes $2 an hour. And that's not a valid number of hours. We're only allowing them to work 80 some hours, and then they have to make at least 750. So let's down to 80. And now the 80 is okay, but the wage is not okay. And then let's have her make $10 an hour. And now we moved over to the other page. Questions. So we're just adding basic validation. And there's something we do on forms. We add the validator on the forms, in the forms PY, and then we add there are things we do on Act 4 to say we want to be validated. And then there are things that we do on the form to say display the message if there was a bad message. Okay. One last thing I want to show you for today, and that's going to be just a trick. It's not really, I'm going to send sort of 2 pieces of data. So we saw before when we had, say, the the drop-down list, the select, then it was sort of sent one piece of information, the value. And I'm going to just send a more complicated value that I'm going to parse and then sort of get two for the price of one. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to use Jinja to split a value that was passed. And I happen to be using a select, a drop-down select. So copy all these. I'm going to go to V and V and overwrite. Okay. So what did I add? Let me go to forms. No new imports. I'm not importing anything new. I'm just playing a trick here in my colors. So this is the new part in this one. This used to say, here was the hex code and here was the color. But now in here, this is the thing, the first thing in the tuple is what gets passed behind the scenes. And instead of sending a simple thing, just either a hex code or a name, I'm sending two things with a vertical pipe as a delimiter. So this is just, you know, nothing's really changed on this side other than I've made what I'm passing a little bit longer. The real work's going to be on the form handler side on the Jinja. So I'm just making sort of a more sophisticated thing that I'm going to pass through. I don't do anything on @4. @4 just validates. That was my only change for the day. The form doesn't change. I'm just saying my changes were to color. I'm just still saying I'm using color. That's all I say on the form. On the handler, that's where things will change. So here's my, on the form handler, here's my color. And here's what comes in. Result color is what comes in. I'm doing some Jinja. Here it is, curly %. That tells me I'm working on some Jinja. I have result color, something I pass through. I'm splitting it on my vertical bar. And then I said, that gives me two things, the column name and the column, not the column, the color name and the color hex code. And so then I'm displaying them both. Here I'm displaying the color name and here I'm displaying the color hex. And I'm also still using the hex code to make the div a color. So this is just a trick. So you can parse within Jinja, and that allows you to send a bigger thing and get sort of two for the price of one in what you pass. So let's run that and see. Control C to stop it. And then run. Bring up this browser. Let's look at the code behind. So this doesn't look any different, but there will be a difference if we look at the code behind. View page source. And where is the color? Here's the color. And you see that my values are more sophisticated. It's the red, the slash, and then the, so as far as HTML concerns, that's just still a string, just a longer string than it was before. So that's what happened on the form side. So I need a name. I'll be Charlie. I need hours. I'll work 30. I'll work for $10 an hour. And let's go over. And here's that separating. The color was red. The color hex was this. And here is this. Now let's look at the code behind here. Again, you don't see the Jinja. The Jinja is server side. but here is the result of the Jinja. I separated the word red from the hex code by splitting, and I can deal with them separately and do different things with them. Okay, so that was fun. So that's just a way to get more than one thing over from one end to the other, from the form to the handler. We can get multiple pieces of information. Any questions on my examples for today? Let me show you what you have to do. Okay, so you're going to probably just mostly copy what I've given you, but you're going to make a form. So you're going to have a forms PY, you're going to have an app PY, you're going to have a form HTML, you're going to have a form handler HTML, you'll probably have a layout HTML because you'll probably just be following what I do, and you'll probably have a style CSS. So you'll have all those files. What are you going to have? You're going to have the user enter a name. It's going to be between 4 and 60 characters. I have 2, you have to change it to 4. I'm so mean. You're going to enter the width of a frame. You're picking out a frame. You have some print or painting or something that you want to get a frame for, and you want to say how wide is your image. And so you're going to give me a box, which is going to be a decimal. So it can be 10.5. But you're not going to frame anything smaller than 8 inches, and you're not going to frame anything larger than 96 inches. Same thing for the height. So you're going to get a width from the user, or a width and a length, or a width and a height, whatever you want to call it. So you're going to have, so the name is going to be like the name. This is going to be like the wage, but with a range on it. And then you're going to have a drop down where the person can choose a style of frame. So they can say, I want a dark brown wood picture frame, or they can say, I want an espresso wood frame. And then this is the information that you're going to pass behind the scenes. They're going to click the button. So this is a select. And then they're going to hit the button to move to the next form. You should be validating. You should see error messages if they don't valid. So if I put in 7 instead of 8 for the length, I should see a message that says it's, it has to be between 8 and 96 or whatever it was. So you should validate and go back to the original form if the data is wrong. And then if the data is right, you should be able to see their name, what kind of frame they want, the width that they put in, the height that they put in, and then you should do this calculation. So there's a base price of $10.40. And then each frame has a factor. Some frames are more expensive. The gold leaf here is more expensive than the dark brown wood frame. So you're going to take that. That's what I'm calling factor. These things are the factors. And you're going to multiply that by the sum of the width and the frame. And then you're going to sort of display that information. So that's what you're to do. That's not due for a long time because next week is I might put a due date of it up next week, but that if you're behind, focus on labs 1 through 7. Anything for the recording? No.